Ahead and call the meeting to order. I'm going to start with the roll call. Janice Brown. Wayne Creedle.
Here.
Benny Gates.
He's here.
Okay. Yana James. Dave Johannes.
Yep.
Preston Lloyd.
Here.
Jennifer Mullen.
Here.
Kendra Norrell. Casey Overton.
Here.
Michelle Parrish.
Here.
Damian Pitt.
Here.
Charlie Wilson.
Here.
Ellen Robertson. Roger York. And Bert Pennock. Okay. We do have a quorum. I've received a request from Eric Mai to participate in the meeting virtual from his home due to a personal matter. I will need a motion to approve Mr. Mai's request to participate in the meeting virtually. Second. Okay, it's been moved and seconded that Mr. Mai can participate virtually. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Welcome, Eric. Can you hear us okay?
I can. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. All right. So thank you all for joining us today for the meeting of the Code Refresh Advisory Council. The council is a subcommittee of the City Planning Commission that is charged with advising the commission, the Department of Planning and Development Review, and the consultant team on the zoning ordinance revision process. The public have an opportunity to speak during the public comment period at the beginning of the meeting. We do have minutes from our last meeting. Staff has amended the minutes to correct a typo regarding the misspelling of a council member's name. So if you've all had a chance to review the notes, I need a motion and a second for approval.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor? Any opposed? The minutes from September, or I should say the meeting notes, I apologize, from September are approved. At this time, we'll open the floor for public comment. This is the opportunity for the general public to comment on any items that are not on today's meeting agenda. So I will start with folks in the room first. Is anyone here that would like to offer comment at this time? Going once. Okay. Is there anyone online that would like to offer comment? Marianne, I'm not seeing any hands or anything. Okay. All right. Well, we will close. There's no one coming forward to offer comment. We'll close the public comment items, or excuse me, the public comment period, and move to the next item on the agenda, which is the Advisory Council Icebreaker. And I'm going to turn that over to Mary Ann to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you all. This was an idea that came from Dr. Criddle, one of our advisory council members, and a way to get the advisory council to know each other better and a perspective on where everybody's coming from. And so the suggestion is if we could go around, you can share your name and then briefly describe when you go outside of your house or your business or your place of work. If you don't live within the city, there's a couple of council members that don't. What do you see? And what is your neighborhood like? And anything else, Dr. Criddle, this came from your suggestion.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah. So we could start. Would you like to start?
Sure. So when I look outside of my house, I see a very single family kind of boring neighborhood for the city. It's not boring. I mean, it's beautiful, but there's nothing like spectacular about it. Old trees, which is one of the reasons why I do like it, because it's older and established neighborhood. Cars parked on the street, which isn't the most attractive driveways and garages. And it's very quiet. We have some pocket parks, which is nice. So I do get a little bit of green space in addition to my yard, which is a nice perk. But really, it's just single family detached homes from the 40s. I see.
I'm Preston Lloyd. I'll mix it up and I'll choose my office, which is on the skyline across out the window there. And so when I walk out the door of my office, where there once used to be a lot of food trucks at lunchtime, it's a little quieter. There aren't quite as many people on the street, and certainly not as many lunch opportunities, which speaks a little bit to the vibrancy of downtown and in the post-pandemic era. And so it's beautiful to be close to the river and to see that, and I certainly appreciate that part. But I think there's probably opportunities to create more activation downtown.
Yeah, sure. When I walk out the door of my house, I see a lot of old buildings built prior to the adoption of Richmond's first zoning ordinance, including a lot of various sort of mid-sized apartment buildings, none of which are allowed under our current zoning. I see a lot of people on the streets. I see a lot of diversity in terms of age and I think to an extent income. On to kind of the diversity of housing units and types in the surrounding area, but very little racial diversity. I see lots and lots of dogs.
Me too. Good point.
Benny?
Benny, I'm gonna talk about at nighttime. So when I come out of my house at nighttime, I see a lot of deer in my yard. And the neighbors across the street, they have deer in their yard because there's water across the street. So we have all single detached single family homes in the neighborhood. And there's a mixture of people in the neighborhood. We have all different ethnicities, and we have young people, we have middle-aged people, not too many old people. I would say that the average age is in 30s, 40s. A lot of other animals. I see possums, I see raccoons, I have a fox, I have a cat that I feed that comes on the yard. There's like all kinds of animals, so it's like a little mini zoo, which is pretty cool. And it's a lot of green grass, a lot of grass. So the neighborhood is probably one of the ones where they have more land than the houses. Most places have more house than land, but the houses are small and the area around the house is a lot larger. So a lot of green space in the front and back. Trees, a lot of trees. Yeah.
Dave?
Boy, this is a tough decision. My office is over by Shindig's, but I'm gonna talk about my house, which is out in the suburbs, about 3,200 feet away from my office. And I walk outside my house, there is a circle of 1921 houses that were built based on the America Beautiful movement, which is part of the European arts and crafts movement. And there's a delightful little fountain in the middle, and beyond the fountain is a magnificent park. So I feel like I live in a pretty spectacular spot.
Nina?
I'll go outside of my office. So I'm in the 9th district in South Garden. And when I walk outside of the office, we're surrounded by the neighborhood. So we have a lot of single family homes there. It is a very large Hispanic population. So definitely see a lot of mixed signage in terms of Spanish and English. But as you go further out, there are also, unfortunately, few abandoned buildings and unfinished sidewalks. So that's something we see, as well as there's a lot of not only vehicle traffic, but a lot of foot traffic that happens in that neighborhood.
I'll go outside of my office. So maybe the opposite of Preston, we're in Scott's Addition. So there's lots of people bustling about because it's a smaller area. So I see cranes and new construction around me. There's a variety of people walking dogs now, walking from offices. I've seen folks pushing baby carriages, which I would have never said 10 years ago in Scott's Addition. But I also walked to lunch today on dirt instead of a sidewalk. So there's still some work to be done.
Yes, when I walk outside of my house, I see a diverse population. And so we have white, black, and Hispanic. Within my particular district, it's very industrial. And actually, last night at our particular civic league meeting, we are trying to see how we can move from industrial from industrial to residential, because we don't have a store as far as for groceries. And so it's harder or it takes longer to go into buy milk where I live. There's a church on my street that's been there for quite a few years. And there are tanks because, again, I live in a more industrial space. And there is a waste management
Casey?
Then, when I walk out of my house, similar to Benny, I see about 4 cats that we feed that will come up probably to get pets and food. And I do just see the neighborhood. I live in a primarily single-family neighborhood with houses that are older. Mine's from the 40s, so I presume that's the case for most of them around. I might see neighbors, a couple of, Churchill elders on my block who I'll chit chat with, and just, generally like working class folks in general who are friendly and, want well for the community. We still have a decent amount of like trees and nature around, so that's nice. And yeah, we have like 2 abandoned properties on our block that have been sitting for quite some time. As far as I know, I've only been there a year and some change. But that's something that we talk about sometimes and is a concern because, we don't know what's going on with those. But we don't have any trouble, so all is well. Just hoping that I don't continue to see older neighborhoods like mine change beyond what the residents want, and that the people who are there can still remain there should they choose.
Michelle?
I am gonna go with my office, which is in the 7th district of Churchill North. I see a lot of development in my neighborhood. I see a lot of division. I see a lot of widening gaps between new development projects that are there and a lot of members of that neighborhood who are kind of struggling with a lot of negatives coming from systematic practices that have been going on for a long time. So, yeah. I think that I every day go into a workplace that's at the intersection of all of the social issues and community struggles that
I go out my front door, I see a streetscape of mostly 1920s pre-zoning homes, but it was a peripheral streetcar suburb, so you saw a blend of that plus more suburban, lower density GDI bill type housing. With that, a lot of socioeconomic diversity, and twice a year you can hear the raceway, very loud and clear. Other than that, it's a nice wooded neighborhood. I've got great access to transit, within a 10-minute walk to 3 different bus lines, and there's a really fantastic Cannon Creek Greenway. Second, which is nice. Very lucky.
Eric?
Oh, sorry.
Sure. I'll go with my office on Robinson Street and the Fan. So when I walk out, I can see businesses and I can see homes, lots of older homes, typical for the Fan. You can also see other uses like a hospital, convenience stores, lots of traffic, both pedestrian, both cars. It's great.
Thank you. Thank you all for taking the time to do this. We might do more activities just so you get to know each other and understand what perspectives we're bringing to the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Mary Ann. Thanks, Dr. Friedel, for making this recommendation. Is to report back and discussion from the September breakout groups. You guys will remember to our last meeting, we broke out in groups and we ran out of time before we could report the findings from each group's discussion. So I think Renee Duverstein is going to walk us through those findings. Renee?
I think we're actually going to ask the people who took the notes to report back if possible. I think Marianne has circulated those back to folks. Is that right?
All right.
People can
Well, if that's the case, we want to start with group 1, which was Maritza, Kendra, and Wayne.
So Wayne was virtual, Maritza's not here, and Kendra's not here. So I will try to quickly improvise some of the questions. the residential questions, there was an interest in consolidating the number of residential zoning districts, combining the R1 and the R2, using some R2 development standards. There was a look at a desire to understand more where R3 is currently located before making a decision about how R3 is modified in terms of the residential districts. The ADU question, I apologize for saying this now. That everyone was pretty open to duplexes and really thinks that might just be a point of conversation as we go through this process, but in their own personal context, the members of that group were open to duplexes in single family districts. In terms of small apartment buildings located along major streets, maybe not zoning for a 10-unit apartment building, maybe that still requires an SUP, but allowing for some additional density along these major streets in the residential district by right. The neighborhood mixed use questions, again, supportive of reducing the number of zoning districts for neighborhood mixed use. Where could commercial be allowed? The conversation was again based on maybe allow anywhere, but maybe based on a certain size, what is permitted, and requiring a retail ground floor and having restrictions on what the size of the commercial uses is what this group was discussing. And then lastly, for the incentivizing affordable housing, we didn't get to all of those questions, but a discussion of maybe we need to target a higher AMI, so something that wouldn't require subsidies, like we should incentivize affordable housing, but at what AMI level should be a point of discussion for the group. That's what group one discussed.
Thanks, Marianne. Group 2, Casey Overton, Charlie Wilson, and Dave Johannes.
Long time ago, so I may editorialize a little bit on this also. Basically, I think our group was very cohesive, and I think we probably swing more toward the liberal side, maybe even relative to the group in terms of zoning and development. And so, relatively speaking, just responding to the questions. Definitely less is more in terms of the zoning districts would make life easier. The ADU, we're thinking that we could move forward to 2 units, that's plenty of opportunities for that sort of activity, which is above what I guess the Richmond 300 suggests. Small apartments along the major streets. Basically, we were for that. That comes with a little bit of a caveat, which is what the line D item here is, which is form-based for multifamily. So we're talking about just putting buildings on or increased density for 10-unit buildings. I think part of the issue is, and I might be editorializing a bit, that it's the form that makes more difference than actually the density. So as we build, that's the line item here that says form-based add for multifamily. Another thing I want to add about the 10 units. In general, when we talk about 10 units is kind of a hard number to work with for development. When you think about a lot of the buildings in the historic areas, their apartment buildings are sort of, we have 2-unit buildings, we have 4-unit buildings, we have 6-unit buildings, we have 12-unit buildings, and those are sort of the patterns of the buildings. And when we just kind of go and put 10 units in there, 10 units is sort of a difficult number to work with. It doesn't split down the middle, 3 and 3 on each side, going up 3 stories or that sort of thing. So that's one thing to think about when we're thinking about units and development, and how that development works is also how does it work in terms of construction and construction patterns. That's editorializing now. Richmond has a lot of multifamily zoning districts. Should some or all these districts be consolidated? Yes, let's just kind of make life simple. respond to historic form and massing, getting back to that idea of form base and responding to the community. Zoning should, new zoning, move away from regulating density. Do not regulate density, pretty blatant statement. Regulate maybe the maximum width of buildings. You know, when we're thinking about, that's another thing about just saying we got a 10-unit building or a 4-unit building. If the lot is 100 feet wide, that's one thing. If the lot is 60 feet wide, that's another thing. So it's difficult to start putting in these regulations and basically requiring or limiting density requirements because we really don't know what we're working with in terms of square footage and where these fit into the sites. Let's see, do not regulate. Should commercial uses be allowed anywhere or should commercial uses, we should have some control regarding or protecting established micro-type nodes and supporting commercial. So basically we're thinking that we can expand it in places, but we should protect other districts in terms of the supporting commercial. Boarding house be incentivized, yes. Positive on Charlottesville. No limits option. Condo financing, that's another item that, and co-op housing. The way our structure work and financing works, these are hard projects to move forward with. And we could be making small, affordable, purchasing homeownership with smaller buildings or mixed use buildings. But because of the financing situation and the way it's run in the country, it's hard to have condominiums, or much harder to have condominiums, especially in single buildings or larger buildings as opposed to a bunch of houses next to each other. Definitely A+ on the Charlottesville approach. Might need some relief in terms of height and yards. That's important if we want to add density. We've got a lot of limitations on that. And then wrapping it up, yeah, fast track permit reviews for lower permit fees for approaches to incentivizing affordable housing.
Thanks, Dave. So group 3 was Philip Hart, Michelle Parrish, and me. Philip was our note taker. He's not here. Michelle, do you want me to go or you want to go? You want me to do it? All right. I got it. So in the residential group discussion or question, we did agree that we should combine some of the single family zoning districts. We felt simpler to have fewer categories. It might result in more housing, but not necessarily affordable. Should the maximum ADU size be increased? Our group, we talked about how we like what we have now, leave it alone and give it a chance because it's only been in effect for a year or less. Concern over these units being, maybe we do need some more flexibility based on property size. Should small apartments be allowed along major streets? We said all multifamily secondary uses in areas already exist with already existing multifamily. And then the neighborhood mixed use questions about the multifamily districts. We said it was okay to merge. We're open to eliminating density, but we need to consider the impact on adjoining single family areas. Should commercial uses be allowed anywhere or should they only be allowed in certain places and be limited in size and scale? We said, yeah, they should be allowed anywhere. Yes to limited size and scale because we want to be careful that we're not changing the nature of the existing neighborhood. And for affordable housing questions, I feel like we spent probably the most time talking about this. And talked about how without incentives, it's going to be hard to build. Zoning is only one piece of the puzzle for helping to get affordable units on the ground, and the city has done as much as it can with the zoning, waiving some restrictive zonings, and we talked about like the parking, waiving parking restrictions. Whether or not what we think of the Charlottesville approach, you know, it's worth considering, and what is going to help drive the private sector in terms of financial realities of getting more affordable units on the ground, because we know it's very complicated financial structures and need different incentives to make those projects pencil out. And then Michelle, Remember not to put you on the spot, but we talked about other zoning related approaches and we talked about Durham's small house option, an area with lower land costs. Maybe that came from Philip.
Yeah, I think they have homes that they're testing out as ways to tackle like homelessness and provide people with like small space, like pallet homes that is an alternative.
Thank you. You have a better memory than me. So we went through that kind of fast, but that was group 3.
I was a note taker for group 4. So we had similar comments to everyone else. Our suggestions were to combine R1 and R2, reduce the lot width to 50 feet for R3 to R6. And then understand the data on how many more lots would be permitted if you consolidated even more. Just trying to understand the political reality of that. And then on the maximum ADU size be increased. We said most current ADUs appear to be detached structures, which are more akin to second dwellings on a lot. Seems more appropriate for increased size. Also appropriate to add 2-family to have ADUs. Small apartment question, additional density with small apartment buildings along major streets, along nodes or bus routes considered design criteria. We thought that most of the opposition to that was again based on a form question and then what the exterior actually looked like. So having some design criteria. Neighborhood mixed use, consolidate all multifamily, we said into one district. And then number 2, we had lot coverage or reduced square footage to dictate density. Need to consider the importance of green space with height. It'd be harder to sell for the neighborhood with existing R53. So going from a lot of green space to none. And then commercial uses, we had commercial uses in certain places limited in size and scale, try to craft like regulations to keep uses to encourage services for neighborhood, reducing lighting after certain hours, limitation for hours. And then affordable housing, we had yes, incentives are necessary as well as process help for speed to market. And the Charlottesville approach, we didn't think that would work. So we didn't have a whole lot of a discussion there, probably worth thinking about. But we also talked about the Durham approach for additional by right development and incentives for keeping existing structures.
Jennifer? So great recaps. I know we all had to kind of reach back in our memories since that discussion occurred a month ago. But with the recap, I want to open it up now for discussion. If there's any comments from the council or any questions of any things that were, yeah, go for it.
Make a quick one and apologize. I was not here last month, but and so I can't speak to the most recent code amendment that Charlottesville adopted, but I've done a number of residential rezonings in that jurisdiction and have some fluency with that process. And so I'd offer some caution as holding that out as a model for Richmond to emulate. And the basis for that is that the city effectively downzoned most of the city so that very little new residential density was available by right, which then had the upside that if you wanted density, you had to go through the mandatory inclusionary process. And you had 2 options. Door number 1, you could include units in your project at a certain reduced rent, and you would have to figure out how to plug the gap in your capital stack. Door number 2 was you could pay your way out of that requirement and just write a check to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. But in either instance, you're going through a discretionary legislative process, which is open to a lot of risk and it disincentivizes a lot of development. And so I think that's a little bit counter to some of the priorities that we've talked about, where we want predictability. We want things to be straightforward and we want as much to be available by right as possible. And again, I'm speaking what was prior to the most recent code update. So I want to make sure that caveat's clear, but I have some hesitation about embracing that as a model for Richmond.
Thanks, Preston. I appreciate your comments and putting you on the spot a little bit. You talked about kind of capital and these projects, and I know at least in my group, we talked a lot about how do you get units more affordable. I mean, 80 to 20% of the AMI sounds great, but that's not the deeper affordability level that we need, and kind of what role the private sector can play, or the challenges for the private sector getting to that level. Is there anything that you can share?
In my view, the only way that you can get to true deep affordability is with rental assistance that are known as vouchers. I don't think that we can provide enough incentive to cover the delta to developers who will not be able to realize the full rents that they would be able to charge, and they would have to restrict rents to such a degree to get 30% AMI residents in those units. That the only way that you can do that is if the city is able to expand the current availability of housing vouchers, which currently are only offered through RHA, and they're limited, and we don't have very many of them. And many of the nonprofit developers have to compete to try to get those project-based vouchers assigned to their projects. I think Better Housing Coalition or Virginia Supportive Housing. The flip side is that there are some innovative programs, such as through Virginia Housing. Virginia Housing has some vouchers that they administer. And so perhaps it's something for the city to consider as to whether there's a way to try to stand up a companion city-initiated rental assistance program, but very, it's just my opinion.
No, thank you, because I am not a developer or land use attorney, so I could not get into the weeds of the challenges of getting to a deeper affordability level. So I appreciate that. Do we have any other questions or comments or any feedback from what we heard from the group? Sounds like for the most part, folks were aligned and combining districts, making it simpler, needing to keep existing neighborhood character in mind as we're, planning for new development, whether that's commercial or residential. It's a quiet group today.
I have a question. I don't want to create any more work for anybody, but I'm curious, would it be?
We're gonna assign it to you.
That's fine. I'm curious as to, would it be helpful to take the consensus of each group and put that in a document? So for example, with question 1, there was a consensus of consolidation. So would it be important for data's sake, to put those together? What do you all think?
Maybe so we can better see where we were aligned, where we were not, and maybe that.
I think, Renee, you can correct me, as a part of your presentation, you're gonna have a little bit of that information.
Yeah, I think we sort of summarized. We wanted to give you guys a chance to report back in your own words, but we kind of summarized some of what we heard reading over the notes, and we're basically going to be kind of going over the same issues again and putting it out for discussion as a big group. So the hope is that we're going to either get to an overall consensus on the different questions today, or at least if we don't agree, we'll at least understand what people's positions are and where they're coming from.
Elizabeth, I do have one comment. I think just piggybacking off of what Preston talked about, it may be helpful for the committee just to receive some information. It doesn't need to be a speaker, but on how affordable housing gets financed, because what Preston just talked about of a private developer, they're basically just foregoing the rent unless there's another subsidy. On a affordable side, there's usually 20 plus sources of funds that come in. So I think for people to understand what it means to get affordable housing out of the ground would be very helpful as we try to work that into the zoning ordinance, because it's one thing to put it in a zoning ordinance, but if you can't implement it, it's not doing any good.
No, I think that's an excellent idea, because it is a complicated topic, and one I think would help the group to hear as we move forward on discussing how to approach housing affordability from a zoning lens. So
we just received that presentation at the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund Board retreat. And so that may be a canned thing that we could
that'd be perfect.
replicate here.
Okay, great.
Eric.
Eric?
Well, I think to Jennifer's comment, maybe the other piece of that is explaining how zoning impacts affordability. And so things, obviously we don't have parking requirements or things like that, but lot requirements, setbacks, height requirements, all these different things that actually impact, highest and best use and what you can actually build. Those all impact me as a developer of single family homes or any type of home in the city. And so just maybe some kind of clarity on, how those things actually connect to affordable housing developer's budget, or even a for-profit developer's budget.
Are you volunteering, Eric? I'm just kidding.
I have I have material on that. I can send.
You have material.
I do, yeah.
No, this is great. I think we
Can I
could
add on?
Charlie?
Yeah, can I add on one more thing? And I think what's being said here is like there's affordability with like a capital A, right? Like this formal top-down, like or whatever program you're going through to subsidize that. And there's like the de facto type of affordability, like what Eric's talking about, where things can. I think was it the Durham example that was talking about like basically a blanket maximum housing permission that you get, which who knows what that smaller house sells for, but I guess theoretically on a de facto basis, that will be more affordable with a lowercase a, right? Not a formal top-down program that the typical applicant is going to have the wherewithal or ability to, even if you're just if you're a developer who owns land and wants to sell more houses, and it's okay taking a small hit on a per unit basis by getting more units out of it, that in a roundabout way yields more affordable housing, just not necessarily capital A affordable housing, but instead.
It does if you can get it financed.
Well, yeah, that too. But we're kind of saying there are two different.
Right. No, I hear you.
Yeah.
Well, and that presentation may talk about more units offers more affordability because there's more units on the market so that people can move up into different places.
Yeah.
Which I assume that.
Yeah. That'd be good.
No, I think Mary Ann, you and I can put our heads together and figure out how we can weave this into the agenda. I think we could definitely spend a whole meeting on these presentations and discussion, probably more than one. But we will see what we can do. It sounds like there's maybe already a presentation and a speaker we could potentially bring in. And then something tells me Eric's got some stuff on the zoning side. So we'll see what we can do to bring this forward for presentation and discussion in a future meeting. Great ideas. So we're at that time where on the agenda where we were going to turn it over to Renee for a consultant presentation on the residential neighborhood mixed use focus. But I don't, if there's anyone else on the advisory group that has comments from the reports we just heard, or Kevin?
I want to ask a question.
I mean, you are the planning director, so we will allow it.
Thank you. Did any of the groups discuss manufactured housing? I know it wasn't a specific question, but did that topic come up in any of the groups?
We talked a little bit about the options and that started with the design standards for, if you were to allow more units, if that would be a possibility, but we didn't get too far into it.
Plotting future agendas, right? We also regulate manufactured housing in terms of just this conversation and how you build the actual product. I just think that's probably gonna be another piece that we're gonna talk about in the future. I just didn't know if anybody talked about it yet.
Yeah, no, great. All right, if there's nobody else jumping up and down with a comment or a question, then we will turn it over to Renee.
Looks like Eric has a question.
Sorry, Renee, pause. I apologize, Eric.
To Kevin's comment about manufactured homes, I would hope that an exploration of that could be included. I know there's some discussion at the state level about manufactured home subdivisions and allowing for that. If some kind of, I know New Hampshire has kind of preempted that, I think, in their state. So just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Eric. Now we'll turn it over to Renee.
All right, thanks. Just to say a few things first before we do a quick presentation. So obviously we're here remotely today. The team is me, Colin's here, and Carlos is here as well. Util is not going to be doing any presenting today. They're still working away on the pattern book, but if there's any questions for Carlos or if he has comments, he's here on the line. Also want to say that we're joined by Kyle Talente today from RKG. So Kyle is part of the consultant team dealing with economic or marketing analysis. And so a bunch of his analysis is appearing in the presentation today that he's going to speak to. Maybe Kyle, I can just ask you to introduce yourself quickly.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. As Renee said, my name is Kyle Talente. I'm the president of RKG Associates. We are a real estate economic development and planning consulting firm headquartered, and I'm located here in Alexandria, Virginia. And as you mentioned, we'll be talking about some of the financial feasibility work that we've done to date around the different zoning options that I'm assuming, Renee, you're going to be presenting this afternoon.
That's right.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. And so just one other thing, again, apologies for not sharing the presentation with you guys earlier. We like to try and circulate it in advance so everybody has a chance to look at it, but we were making some adjustments until the last minute today. So apologize, we'll try to circulate it earlier next time, but hopefully we'll have enough time for a good discussion today. In terms of what we're going to be presenting, you'll see in a sec here, we're basically kind of going over a lot of the issues that were discussed last week or last month and were raised by the report back just now. I just want to kind of go back through them again and really kind of get a full group discussion, because when we looked at the notes, there seemed to be quite a lot of differing opinions about some of the questions. So I want to sort of be able to get everybody together and have a discussion and like I said, either get to a consensus or get to a point where we disagree, but we understand each other's points and where everybody's coming from. The other thing that we did is that we kind of, some of the questions required a little bit more let's say, research or information to try to inform them better. And so part of that is the analysis that Kyle was able to help us with. We also added a few more things here. So with that idea, it may change, I think it already has changed our views on a couple of the questions. It may change yours as well. So with no further ado, I'll share the presentation. Give me a second here. So I'm going to go through the whole thing first. If there's questions of clarification, if you don't understand something, feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to have to ask the chair or staff to facilitate, because I can't really see you that well in the camera. And then, but I'm going to save the full discussion for after the presentation, if that's all right. So we'll circle back and we'll go through the questions again individually after I finish the presentation. So follow up to September. So again, we've sorted this into the residential land use area in Richmond 300 and the neighborhood mixed use. So starting with residential here, just to remind you, here's on the left-hand side, the areas that are designated residential in Richmond 300, and on the right-hand side, the zoning that's currently applied within those areas, mostly R1 through R5, which is single family, a little bit of R6. So we presented this as a kind of proposal. I'm just going to remind you of this again last time, consolidating R1 and R2 into a new district that we called RN1, and using standards that are similar to R2, so allowing smaller lots than are currently below the minimum lot size and width for R1. This map here is just to it's a little bit clearer than what you might have seen before. There were some questions in the discussion about where exactly is R1 and R2. So this is showing where R1 and R2 are located, mostly in the west, some north and some south of the river, a little bit in the north and a little bit in the south. So this was one proposal we put on the table. The other one was combining R3, R4, and R5. So what you see on the map here. And we would propose to combine those into what we called RN2, which is similar to R5, a little bit smaller lot sizes allowed. And then we suggest the possibility of the sort of bonus based on the scenario in Durham that would allow you even smaller lots, but it would limit the maximum size of houses built in that area. So we allow you to build a large number of small houses. So just reminding you of this thing again here. And then there's a question that I just wanted to respond to in the notes that we got from the groups last time. Somebody said, well, looking at this, R3 is probably, of all these districts, the one that's going to undergo the most change because it's on the lower end of this combination. I guess theoretically you could combine R3 into R1 and R2 if you wanted to, but we're really kind of upzoning it quite a lot. So what would that look like? Or where is that located? Here's where R3 is in the city. Just to refresh your memory or remind you, we've added a few kind of labels here of neighborhoods. Obviously, this is not covering everything, but just giving you some sense of where that's found today, and a couple shots of those R3 neighborhoods. And happy to talk about that more, especially if there's anybody who lives in one of those areas. In terms of this analysis, I'm maybe going to allow Kyle to jump in on this here. So this, I know this is a lot of numbers here. The map you're seeing on the right-hand side is the marketing map that we created with staff and with RKG. So just to kind of aggregate the city into a few different kind of bigger areas that had, from a marketing perspective, some kind of similar characteristics, just because it was just too much to kind of use tiny neighborhoods or blocks. So we were able to run some of these different scenarios on different combination of these six different marketing areas that we created. And so this is testing out two different scenarios here, looking at the currently zoned R3 parcels. Scenario 1 is showing the upzoning to RN2 base. So that's taking R3 and allowing it to have lots as small as 5,000 square feet and as narrow as 50 feet wide. And then scenario 2 is testing out the bonus. So lots as low as 2,000 square feet and 20 feet in width, but limited to a small size of house. Kyle, do you want to speak to this, what you're seeing on the screen right now?
Sure. So what we did is we took these scenarios and we ran them through a financial feasibility model where we've collected a substantial amount of data about market, everything from construction costs to price points for ownership housing and rent levels for multifamily development based on these 6 different sub areas that you see here on the map. So we were trying to make sure that the analysis was relevant to these different areas of the city. The numbers that you're looking at here is what we calculated what the value of the properties would be, which is, if you look where it says land value, under these new scenarios. And so that's effectively to be able to hit market rate return expectations for a private developer. What would the underlying value of that property, whether it's developed or not, be for them to implement this change? So either acquire a property and either add a unit to an existing unit or to tear down that unit and build 2 new units. We were trying to understand, what that would be worth to someone. And then we compared those calculated land values to what the current market value is of those properties in the different sub areas. And so the next 2 rows, the vacant lots and developed lots, show you what's the total number of lots that meet the R3 10,000 square foot in size limitations that are under the zoning, and then how many of those are valued at below what the land value would be for a investment or a redevelopment of those properties. And so for this first one, for sub area 2, and by the way, just for notation, in sub area 1 and sub area 3 for this particular scenario, there were no lots zoned R3 that were under 10,000 square feet, according to the property assessment database, which is why there's no information for them. That all being said is, when you're looking at it, we looked at, well, how many of these lots are worth less than what the value of the land would be under these new development paradigms? And then we looked at what the likelihood of the rate of change would be based on how much less than what the value created would be. So for example, in sub-area 4, under scenario 1, the land value for that 10,000 square foot lot would be slightly above or slightly below $520,000. Or how many of the lots in that sub-area are worth at or below $520,000? And if it was worth $510,000, the likelihood of someone willing to sell their home and move to make a $10,000 gain on the value of their home is substantially less than if it was only worth $200,000, where someone showed up at the door and said, hey, I'll give you $500,000 for this property. They'd be more propensity to relocate. And so you're looking at what was the underlying value of the land based on these redevelopment scenarios, how many lots meet that requirement, how many will fall below, and then what we calculated to be a rate of change based on market activity and the likelihood someone would be willing to sell their home. In this particular example, The reality is the R3 properties, there aren't very many that hit these value requirements that would motivate a seller to sell based on what the market would be willing to pay for it. So if I were to summarize this particular example, as you can see, the second numbers in the second and third columns, there's not very many of them that would fall below the values that were created under the zoning. And so it's unlikely that you would see a lot of change in R3 based on these two scenarios, based on the parameters that Renee was talking about. And I promise the next explanations will be a lot shorter because I gave you the background on this one.
Yeah, sorry. That's I know it's a lot to take in, and it took us a while to get our heads around it as well. But I would just say that yeah, I think that the conclusion of this is that it seems that there would not necessarily be like a lot of uptake on this sort of upzoning. So this kind of allowing this bonus here and the base. I still think there may be value in combining these zones together just for simplicity into the kind of the RN2 base, just to make the code a bit easier to read. But it seems like there's not going to be a whole lot of uptake on this scenario. At least that's what we're showing.
And I think
Renee, if you could pause for just a second. I know that we're going to have discussion at the end of your presentation, but this is a heavy slide and a lot. While we're just went through it and it's fresh on everyone's mind.
Yes.
Did anyone have any questions? It's a lot, so I want to open the floor briefly. We can talk about it in more detail later, but while it's fresh, Charlie.
We get a reminder on the mapping of the two proposed districts. Would they be basically the same on a mapping perspective? You just have the quote unquote bonus option to do that other thing?
That's correct. Yeah.
Interesting.
So I mean, that's just the proposal. We could consider changing it, but that's what we threw out last month.
And I mean, it's worth reminding folks this is based on current economic conditions, right? So we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And we're also just looking specifically at R3, right? So, you know, the proposal that we've talked about making is consolidating R3, R4, and R5, which we haven't looked at in its as a group together.
And so this analysis was kind of like trying to quantify the social behavior of someone prospectively approaching somebody. And that's where these numbers are derived from. I'm really fascinated by this. I'm just trying to understand the basis of the developed this chart here.
It's do you want me to respond? Do you want me to respond?
Yeah, Kyle, if you could speak to it. Yeah, no, if you could respond, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So thank you, by the way, Colin, because that was exactly the point I was going to make, which is this is based on current market conditions. In future, you never know what could happen. But to answer your question directly, yes, in a way of speaking, is we were trying to understand, based on current market conditions, if this change were to be made in the zoning code, what would be the likely impact on the transformation or the investment in this zoning district in these different areas of the city based on the value it would or frankly would not create. And so we were trying to understand to help our role in this is saying, okay, if we make this change, is it going to affect any sort of investment? Is it going to actually come out with the results that we are looking for without any sort of public investment or public intervention to make it happen? So yeah, the goal here was for us to try and use market information to determine the likelihood of how these would impact these zoning choices.
Jennifer, just a quick question. I'm fascinated by this as well. Was anything run as to what actually makes people develop? I mean, how many more units are necessary to move it off of the likelihood of zero?
We have not gone down that path. We ran very specific scenarios right now, and this is definitely something that we could work with Colin and Renee on. You know, what would trigger half the units potentially being transformed based on a prescribed allocation or allotment of development. So, you know, for example, for scenario 2, as Renee mentioned, it allows 5 units, but they're substantially smaller and per square foot of what they're allowed to be on the property. And so that has an impact on return because you're only going to be able to sell, for example, and I'm making these numbers up, 1,000 square foot house for a certain amount as opposed to a 2,000 square foot house. And so that has an influence on what that is. And so there's a number of levers, if you will. There's a number of variables we can model to see how that would impact what the underlying value of that parcel would be under a new zoning paradigm, and then how that would affect investment, the investment likelihood for a community.
I think that would be worthwhile analysis if we could add that to the to-do list.
Yeah, I think just thinking about it in terms of other districts that have been created more recently, you still see a significant number, and it's more on the mixed use side, a significant number of special use permits because people need 1 or 2 more stories to make the math work because of the type of construction. Not, I mean, it's very different than residential, but just to understand what that breaking point is and how you then can achieve it through a zoning that wouldn't then require you to have to go get a special use permit.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Just again, we're just talking about residential right now, so there's a kind of a,
Yeah, I was just
there's
saying
a
that.
ceiling as to how intense you can go.
Yep.
But yeah, and I just would say again, the reason why we tested the existing R3 here was that it was the one that was kind of going to get the most bonus based on the situation here, right? So R5, not much change between R5 and what we're promoting, and R4 is in the middle. So R3 is sort of the one that would undergo the most change. But looking at this, it seems like there's not going to be a whole lot of uptake. Obviously, R3 is located in different parts of the city than R4 and R5, so maybe based on location, there might be something different going on there. But as a sort of a starting point, we just looked at this. So I'm going to keep moving on. I know I want to try and get through this as quickly as we can so we can have a good discussion, but I understand that this is a bit to wrap our heads around. So there's a question here. I'm going to kind of skip over these. We'll ask you the questions afterwards when we get to the discussion. The next point, so just following up on what we discussed last time, was the idea about ADUs and duplexes. ADUs are already allowed. We sort of asked, would you be willing to consider duplexes in all residential areas, so all single family zoned areas, given that you can already build an ADU. Kyle took a look at the numbers for this as well. Kyle, do you want to jump in on this?
Sure. And so we looked at this as an opportunity. Interestingly, in some of the districts, there was a little bit more potential here, only because of the change in development type and the returns that created. If you look at particular areas 5 and 6, while it's not substantial, there were more likely opportunity for investors to come in and execute upon this new zoning classification. What you're looking at in the annual rate of change, just to give a little bit more detail, is our estimates based on pattern of behaviors in other communities that we've done similar analyses, how many we think would happen on an annual year, and what percentage of that is the overall number of parcels. And the reason why we did that is in a lot of communities, there's always concern, if you make this change, will the entire neighborhood change overnight? Or what is the likelihood of the impact of this? And so that's what we wanted to kind of give folks a sense of, based on how in other communities investors have behaved, what an estimated, to be honest and be fair, amount of change that would happen in a year-over-year basis. But there's a little bit more movement here, particularly in sub areas 5 and 6, where this could be a viable alternative, particularly, as Colin mentioned earlier, if market conditions change a little bit over time.
Yeah, and again, this is looking at the R3 zone, and so it's the scenario is basically saying you're allowed to do what we suggested, so go from a 10,000 square foot minimum down to 5,000 square feet. But in this scenario, it's basically two houses that are touching each other, that are produced out of one current property. So multifamily along major streets was the next topic here, and so this was, if you recall, in Richmond 300, there's talk about allowing within the residential area small multifamily buildings, potentially up to as many as 10 units along major streets that pass through the residential area. So this is what you're seeing on the map here, the residential area and the major streets that pass through. However, lots of questions about, do we allow in all major streets? Are there different gradations, et cetera? So we'll be asking those questions to you in a moment. So for these areas, we proposed a kind of a new zone that we called RN3 that would allow basically everything up to small multifamily. So single family detached, single family attached, two family detached, and multifamily up to 10 units, just along those frontages. So we had, again, Kyle run a few different scenarios here, looking first of all at R1 and then afterwards at R5. So we're talking about, again, the R zones that front on these major streets they run the whole range of R zones. So there's R1, R2, R3, R4, and R5. We just picked the sort of the kind of the low end and the high end of the spectrum. So R1 are the largest lots right now, lowest density. R5 are the smallest lots, the highest density within the single family category. And we just said, if you were allowed to take these lots and build some of these scenarios on them, what would the uptake be? And so 3 different scenarios here. One of them is saying allowing townhouses. Kyle had sort of let us know he thought there was a really strong market for townhouses in Richmond. The other one allowing stacked townhouses. And then the third one allowing multifamily up to 10 units. So small apartment buildings, essentially. And we ran these on R1 and R3. So Kyle, do you want to say, talk to these just briefly?
Absolutely. And so as you see in the graphic, in different areas, you're going to have different results. For example, sub-area 2, doing the smallest footprint, which would be the 10 townhouse units, would likely not result in much change at all. Whereas if you go to the 20 unit or the 30 unit multifamily strategy on these properties, there's a lot more likelihood and there was a lot more potential for investment. As opposed to in sub-area 4, because housing is frankly, housing ownership or rental is so valuable, you create a substantial amount of value and there would be a lot of opportunity there for conversion. Now, there's not, at least for R1 in those districts, there's not a lot of parcels per se, as you can see. That being said, there would be a tremendous amount of interest for this type of investment along the major commercial corridors in sub-area 4. Sub-area 5, sub-area 6, there just weren't very many parcels, to be very, very frank, to be able to, there's just not a lot of R1 that are along major commercial corridors there. But it's particularly under the scenario of allowing a higher density of ownership, the 20 stacked townhomes concept that Renee was talking about, there would be interest and that would create opportunities for the few properties that do exist in these areas. And so from our perspective in that regard, and ownership, trying to maximize yield along a commercial corridor for ownership is something that would be more than likely absorbed in the marketplace for those 2 sub areas.
So, and just to say again, so this is taking one R1 lot, which is 20,000 square feet or more in size. So these are huge lots. Scenario 1 is saying replacing that with 10 townhouses in a kind of a courtyard or a cluster. Scenario 2, 20 stacked townhouses or 20 units of stacked townhouses. So it could be occupying the same size, but small units. And then the third one, 3 multifamily 10 unit complexes. So this is R5. So Kyle, this to you again.
Sure. Well, and similarly, in areas where this exists, because you're providing 10 or 20 or even 30 units, now, mind you, you would have to consolidate. You would have to assemble 3 parcels because R5 lot size is 6,000. So to be able to do these developments, you would require at least 3 lots. So you wouldn't just be able to acquire 1, you'd have to acquire 3 to be able to do it. Creating this level of intensity, even by assembling these 3 lots to be able to get something close to a half an acre, would create a substantial amount of value and it would create investment opportunities. The ownership strategies, scenario 1, the 10 townhomes, or scenario 2, the 20 stacked, frankly have the greatest impact on the potential for that kind of development. However, a 30-unit multifamily concept on a half an acre of commercial frontage also would provide value. And so these alternatives would have an impact on the investment potential for investors to be willing to come in and do projects like these.
Right. I'm going to keep moving on here. I'll get back to these questions afterwards. I'm just going to go ahead to the next section, which was neighborhood mixed use. So just a reminder of where these areas are. Neighborhood mixed use on the left-hand side, where it's indicated in Richmond 300, and then the current zoning on the right-hand side, which is kind of a whole range of things from single family to two family to multifamily today. And we proposed here looking at areas combining R6 and R7 into the same district that we showed you before, RN3. So this would be, again, a district that allows single family detached, single family attached, two family detached, and multifamily of up to 10 units. And so part of the idea here is that, within historic neighborhoods like the Fan, that are today zoned not more than two family, there are existing non-conforming small apartment buildings like the one you see right here, scattered around. Allowing this would bring those up to conformity. When we presented this last time, I think there was like a bit of concern about, well, if we allow these sort of buildings in places, are people going to acquire a bunch of the lovely old townhouses in the Fan and tear them down and replace them with apartment buildings? We ran a bit of a scenario here, just specifically on sub areas 1 and 4, so the kind of urban neighborhoods on the east and the west end, to show what the level of likelihood would be of that happening, and I think it's fairly low. So the need to kind of assemble a large number of properties together adjacent, and to replace them with something that's not giving you a whole lot more gain in terms of units is pretty unlikely to happen, I would say. Is that fair? Is that a fair reading, Kyle?
Well, it's only taken you 3 slides to take over my job, Renee. I'm very impressed. But yes, you're spot on.
Okay. So we'll circle back to these afterwards. Like I said, I'm just trying to get through this. This is getting towards the end here. So the other one that we talked about was, with multifamily, we talked about the sort of the fairly strict density requirements right now that cap out developments at a maximum density. We talked about combining a variety of different multifamily zones, R43, R48, R53, and R63, throwing out the density requirements and turning them into 2 new zoning districts that we called RX3 and RX5. Those are mostly characterized by height. So we'd be sort of not restricting density, but we would be restricting form. So one for 3 stories and one for 5 stories. And we ran one scenario just in a pretty limited way on R43, and show that there would be a little bit, but not a whole lot of uptake on that in terms of allowing a larger multifamily there. We're going to have to circle back to this again and take a look at some of those other districts, because I think we didn't really get enough of a sample to understand what the impacts of this would be.
Yes, I agree with that, Renee. I think by limiting it to just R4, I think we need to expand kind of our horizons and then rerun it and see how it comes out. But I would say that generally my understanding of the market and what the limited we have is it does have potential. It's just that we need to maybe get a bigger sample size to get a true understanding of what the potential is for this zoning in terms of current market conditions.
Yeah, so we'll have to kind of go back to that, maybe take a look at the other zones and maybe come up with some different scenarios to see if there's a way that can work. For R63, kind of similar, though it looks like there's a little bit, maybe a little bit more potential here in a couple different sub areas.
Yes.
And then I'm going to wrap this up. So I'm going to circle back to you guys again. I'm just going to go back to the questions that we asked here. And these are mostly following up on what was discussed last time, but with this information under our belt, and feel free to ask more clarifying questions if you're having trouble still with some of this. But with this information might help us inform the decisions a little bit more. So back to the single family districts. So based on the information presented, do you feel any differently now about the consolidation of the current 5 single family districts that we proposed? Do you feel like it's a good idea? Do you feel like it's not achieving enough? Is there a different way that you'd like to do it? And I would just put this out to the whole group. And again, I'm relying on the chair and others to facilitate.
I think it looked, I'm sorry, Dave, did you? Oh, I thought you were starting to raise your hand first. No, okay. Damien?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a clarifying question. We went through this series of slides looking at, kind of this modeling, if I can articulate this correctly, a modeling of what the potential market impact would be of these proposed zoning changes, or these, sort of draft changes. And if I'm understanding correctly, I think what I was hearing was a lot of like, this is result in a lot of new types of development. Is that an explanation of some of those tables we were looking at?
I'm not sure exactly. So I think what we basically came up with were a bunch of scenarios to sort of say, okay, if you change the zoning requirements, what would the market do? So would they take you up on that, or would they, would things kind of continue on the way that they are right now? And so we were trying to see, if we're going to go through a change. I mean, I guess there's benefits other than market benefits, and just in terms of simplifying the zoning or whatnot. But if we are going to go through a change, is there a real benefit to that in terms of encouraging intensification in places that we want to see it, encouraging different housing options, or is the market not going to take us up on it? And I think that we got sort of mixed results on that. In some areas, it seemed like there was going to be a fair bit of uptake, particularly on the major streets going through residential areas, and probably not as much uptake on some of the other scenarios.
Okay, well, okay, so then in that case, I wonder if, because on the one hand, at one point you made the point that, this would be sort of like, could, mitigate concerns and fears in certain types of neighborhoods about perceived like massive changes, and that was kind of presented as a good thing, which I can see the point there, but like overall, the point of this whole endeavor that we're doing here is to figure out how to accommodate 30,000 new housing units, right? I mean, that's what Richmond 300, analysis said we needed. That's what the whole future land use map is intended to do. So I think that I'm fearing we might be undershooting that if a lot of the takeaways are that this is not going to stimulate new market development.
Yeah, understood. I think so. I think first of all, just to say, we're still looking just at residential and neighborhood mixed use categories now. There certainly will be a lot more development in the other mixed use categories. But yes, I think your point's well taken. I think we're looking for more opportunities for development. Some of these tests I think didn't pan out. I think there's some that we need to do a little bit more work on to understand them more. But yeah, I would say of these ones here, like I said, the sort of options for kind of development along major streets was sort of the one that seemed to be attracting the most potential for development.
And in that case, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm kind of misinterpreting if you're saying that it did say along major streets, it might spur development. And if you're saying we haven't even gotten to some of the other types of future land use visions for like the nodes, right? So and all of which was where the bulk of the housing is kind of envisioned to go in the first place from under Richmond 300, right?
Yeah, so maybe it may be okay, but I think we're looking to see what we can do here.
Raise that sort of general train of thought as we evaluate these market projections. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Remind me, when you made those spreadsheets, was it a question of a property being redeveloped or a vacant lot that got upzoned? Because that's totally different.
It was actually both. So it was basically taking all the properties that currently have that zoning and testing out the change. So I think we showed both vacant and developed lots on this list here.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, using the R3 as an exercise, I don't know, if a client approaches me and says, hey, I've got an R3 property I'm looking at with a house that's falling apart on it, for instance, I can buy this property for $100,000, just making a number up. And then I'm like, okay, great. If you do the RF2 or bonus, what was the acronym? I can't remember. Sorry.
RN2 or RN2 bonus. Yeah.
It's like, okay, great. You can do 5 starter homes here, and they'd probably be pretty happy about that. So I'm just trying to understand what these charts are trying to predict, and that was part of why I was asking a clarification of, was this a vacant property? Was this someone who lived there and that was their embodied cost of, oh, now I have to up and leave, now I have to move. What is that worth to me? Like that, it's a very tough thing, and it's admirable that you guys are trying to figure this out, because it's an important question. I just want to make sure it's actually reflecting upon what we're trying to figure out here, to Damien's point.
David, did you? Yeah, I think it's going to have the same sensibility. I'm thinking of some of the developments that have gone on, and maybe just going with the single family stuff that we're talking about right now. I'm thinking about somebody buys a house and maybe they get a lot next door or it's a double wide. And all of a sudden they get to the point where they can convert that into, where they're converting into 5 homes on 17, 18, 1900 square feet in a $1 million neighborhood. And so I have the feeling that where real estate is most valuable, people will find ways to spur on more development in these. And the same thing when we go into the R43s and some of the opportunities, or R48s, some of the opportunities that we have. In using existing structures, we also have the opportunity to not go from scratch, but we have the opportunity to add on, develop up these things in. And we're seeing a lot more of that going on, I think, in the central city where people are finding these impossible places. And we're still finding ways to add several little pieces of units in different places, or a stack of units, or they're buying multiple properties so that we can accomplish the same thing. So I still think there's more value than what we're seeing in some locations.
Yeah, I would say also that, again, this is aggregated. So, you know, these 6 areas are averaged out. Obviously within them, you get pockets of, you know, higher and lower values, for sure. And same thing with, you know, the condition of developed lots. If it's a, you know, occupied by a house that's ready to be torn down versus a house that's brand new, this is just a kind of an aggregation of that. So it is simplified substantially.
Is it worth understanding how, just crudely, Kyle, how you come up with that land value?
Sure.
Where that comes from? I mean, because what I found fascinating was how different that number was across the community. Like, I found that pretty staggering that sub area 4, for example, here is 519,000 and sub area 2 is 94,000.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think is maybe not that intuitive is that we have 2 scenarios. One of them is saying you're taking a 10,000 square foot lot and you're turning it into 2 lots, and the other one is you're turning it into 5 lots. But in some places, the value for 5 lots is actually lower than 2 lots, although it, you know, it varies from one to the other.
Yeah, so very quickly, the best I can without getting too technical is, if anyone understands how real estate investment works, you have construction costs, you have operational revenues, which for an ownership home is what you collect when you sell it. For a multifamily development, it's the rent that you collect over time. And then you have your operational costs. And obviously on an ownership, you generally don't have any. You build it, it costs you money to construct it, you turn around, you flip it, and you move on with life. On a rental, it's a lot more nuanced, where you cost to construct, cost to operate, and then the revenue that you collect. What we calculated is based on what we've learned from the development community in the greater Richmond area, is what return expectations are for various ownership and rental properties. And so we ran the pro forma based on current market conditions, and Renee nailed it on the head that these are averages. So for example, within area 6, you know, we calculated an average of cost of development and cost of revenue. And we understand that there's going to be nuance within that, where some areas are going to be more valuable and some areas are going to be less. You know, the challenge is Richmond is a pretty big city, and the level of complexity to run this, you know, block by block is substantial. And so we do recognize the fact that, to Renee's point, is these are averages of averages for fairly large areas, and it's not going to be absolute in specific micro areas of these 6 sub areas. That all being said, is we run the pro forma, we calculate what the return of the property is, and then we solve for a land value that tells us what, if someone were to offer, and using sub area, for example, $519,586, under scenario 1, they would be able to make the market expected return to develop 2 houses on that, 2 houses on 5,000 square foot lots, as opposed to 1 house on the 10,000 square foot lot. And then we compared that number against what the current market value is for both vacant and developed lots, to understand how that expected value compares to what someone who owns a lot in that area, in that zoning, at that size, would expect to be able to gain for their unit. So to use the example that someone made earlier on the phone or on this call, in the example, I buy a dilapidated property in sub-area 5 for $100,000 because it's needs to be torn down. If that's where it was located, it would be likely that they would take advantage of the zoning because that is below what the purchase price of that lot would need to be to make the investment happen, as opposed to if they did that in sub area 2, for example, maybe they probably could make it work for the 2 larger single family homes, but the cost of construction, particularly parking, based on the assumptions that we made, you're not able to make as much money on the sale of the 5 smaller houses, as I mentioned earlier, because a 1,000 square foot house you can't charge the same as one 2,000 square foot house. And so you have construction costs, you have fixed costs. I know I'm getting into a very long, detailed discussion. I'm sorry, but it's the best I can do in terms of trying to understand it. And I do recognize, yes, there is going to be specific issues where, for example, the market value identified in the county's, in the city's property assessment database may not accurately reflect what someone could acquire it for. And so there are going to be some disconnects, but we were trying to understand the order of magnitude of what the potential impact would be. Would all the lots in that area be subject to redevelopment based on the value created, or in other cases, would none of them? And yes, there's going to be a margin of error. We definitely recognize that. But we were trying to understand, to the question that was asked earlier, will this put the entire neighborhood in the crosshairs of reinvestment and see it change very, very rapidly? Because, and I'm going to use an over-exaggeration example, we've created $1 million value for $200,000 properties. And so that's kind of the best I can do.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. Renee, do you mind taking it back to the slide that has the question that you posed on it? I'm going to kind of gently push back at something that I interpreted as sort of being below this question, which is the suggestion that based on the market analysis that was provided, if the utilization based on today's market forces, which was just very well explained, is not significant. In other words, if the consolidation doesn't lead to an expected immediate yield of additional housing units, is it worthwhile? And my pushback is that I'm not sure, and this has been said earlier, but I don't think that's the sole driver of our consideration about whether we would find value in the consolidation of these districts. It's certainly an important factor, and having this analysis and an understanding of what would happen is, I think, really important. But to me, I think, one, the efficiency that's gained and the just greater understanding of how this would, the efficiencies that come from the consolidation are valuable in and of itself. But secondly, the fact that there won't be an immediate market reaction. There may be over time as land appreciates and there's the additional ability to amortize new units on undeveloped or underutilized parcels of land. We may see more units come from that over time, but it's not going to be like a knee jerk. Everybody's going to jump in and try to add additional units within our established residential neighborhoods. To me, that's almost a positive. Like it's a good gut check to know that if we were to make this move, it's not going to create such chaos within our established neighborhoods that is going to create a destabilizing effect that will probably have a negative overall impact on the community's view of the zoning rewrite as a whole. And so I do think that we're going to get to other tools that are going to help to increase the number of units at scale. But when we look at the traditional neighborhoods, seeing that they won't have an immediate rush to try to capitalize on additional value that's been created by the regulations consolidating is probably a good thing for us to be aware of.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Does anybody else want to? Sorry, go ahead.
I think I agree with what Preston's saying, but also the flip side of that is that if we scale out and think about the big picture of perceptions and is this ultimately going to be passed or not, we also have to worry about the perception that all of the new growth and new density and such is being channeled into different types of neighborhoods that aren't our existing single family neighborhoods. Right. So there's a balance there. And I think that to the earlier question, I think making sure that we're at least allowing duplexes by right throughout these types of districts would provide some, sort of defense against that argument that we're giving the folks who live in these areas a free pass, so to speak.
Can I jump onto that question? I can't tell if other people have their hands up in the room.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead here. So so the possibility of allowing duplexes in all single family districts was raised before. Looking over the comments from the groups, there was a variety of different opinions. Some people said, well, it's not really single family anymore if you do that, or it's going to change the character of those neighborhoods in a way that we don't like. Others said it would be good for intensification, or it's a good option to have. For those who disagree, are there situations where you would be willing to allow duplexes in areas that are currently zoned for single family? So for example, if it was designed to look like a single family house, or if it was limited in scale in some other way. That's one question. And then the last question here was raised by somebody was, the possibility of allowing ADUs for in the back of, or as part of two family uses, duplexes. So areas where you're already allowed to do two family. Currently, you're not allowed to do an ADU there. But do we think that's something that should be allowed? So two kind of separate questions here, I would say. I'll put that out to the group.
How does everyone feel about the duplexes in areas already single family ADUs?
Just those that front onto the specific streets that Richmond 300 specifies that should be allowed in the residential areas.
Renee, did you hear that?
No, yeah, so no, we're not talking yet about major streets. We're talking about the sort of the base kind of case for residential areas. So we're talking about the interior right now. So right now you can build an ADU in any single family district, right? So we said, okay, if you can already build an ADU, should you be able to build a duplex? Or is that going too far? Is that crossing a line?
Well, I guess I'll pose a fact pattern. I'll take the fan, for example, where you have existing single-family residences that often have a carriage house in the back on some of the larger lots. But also in the same neighborhood, you frequently have duplexes that are in a similar form to the single-family home. So as they present to the street, it's very difficult to tell at first glance whether it's a duplex or a single-family home. This seems to create an arbitrary distinction that would say if you're the duplex, you don't get to have your carriage house be an ADU, but if you're a single-family owner, then you do.
Yeah, so my understanding is that currently that is the case, that if you have a duplex or two family use or something else like that, you can't do or multifamily, you can't do an ADU as well. So that's sort of the second question here.
If I'm speaking personally, I wouldn't see the harm in at least in most places allowing for duplexes throughout single family Richmond 300 areas. That's just me personally, because I mean, if we're serious about answering for our housing shortage, like that's a very borderline milquetoast way of doing it, cast across the entire city. And it's not like to your previous point about the market conditions, it's not going to set the world on fire, but it allows it to happen with minimal legislative process, and it has the benefit of staying within the residential building code, which certainly does matter. So
I would agree with that as well in terms of where we are in the 9th district, as far as it being a lot of single family homes in that area, where, sight unseen, I feel like it would be fine given some of the living situations that people are in currently in those areas. So I think it wouldn't hurt to have these types there as well.
Is there anybody who didn't agree with the idea of duplexes in single family zoned areas that wants to kind of speak to that?
I'm just going to be honest that I was kind of the NIMBY in my group. Not that I opposed duplexes, but I thought of my neighborhood, which is all single family, and the fact that, we have literally nowhere to park now. We start doubling up on these small lots. What does that do to the neighborhood? And, I can live with it. I chose to live in the city and somewhere where I have to park. I may not always get to park in front of my house, but it's not something that's overly welcomed. And I think you will hear some pushback from the community in some of these older established neighborhoods about, you know, potentially having a duplex, particularly if it's a tear down and doesn't fit with the community, existing neighborhood community. So I'm not gonna hide the fact that I had some NIMBYism in my group on that, but it's just something that we hear often in the planning commission when projects like this come forward. So just something to think about.
And to the question, is there anything that we could do through zoning that would make you feel better or think that people would react more positively to it in terms of form requirements or whatnot, or parking?
I mean, then I think we're going backwards where we've already lifted the parking restrictions
Yeah.
and I don't want to see that either. I'm just saying, I think this is what, you know, when this gets out to the community, we may all agree that duplexes and single family neighborhoods are great, but these are the things that we're going to hear from the community. We need to have prepared answers for.
Well, and for what it's worth, in some of our more established historic residential neighborhoods, parking is already a challenge. And the way that the city has addressed that is through parking regulation. And is a statutory process, it's not part of the zoning ordinance, where the city has the ability to create special parking districts that have permits that are issued by the city.
Permits.
Not every neighborhood is eager to avail themselves of that regulatory option, but it's certainly been one that's been used to try to address this concern. It's outside of zoning.
And I'm just raising the concern. I could, you know, personally in my neighborhood, there could be a duplex and depending on how it's designed, I wouldn't even know. I mean, and that's one of the beauties of duplexes. And they also fit well in some neighborhoods, but I just think we need to be mindful of what we're going to hear from the community because we hear it now.
Yeah, definitely.
Any other comments on this before I move on? Sorry.
Yeah, I have another comment. I probably live in a neighborhood where half the neighbors might be concerned about houses being converted into duplexes. It's Bird Park. But there are multifamily buildings there and they have small units in them and they're really nicely maintained and they're really a nice part of the neighborhood. At this day and age, in this era, building more services, I think it's really important that we always look towards the sustainability of taking advantage of the services we have and not expanding them. So I would be very supportive of duplexes in any neighborhood.
All right. I'm going to go on to the next question, if that's okay. So this is probably the biggest one in the presentation today. This is about multifamily on major streets within the residential area. So questions here. So in September, you were asked under what circumstances small multi-unit buildings of up to 10 units should be allowed along a major street. We heard a whole range of different options. And so some criteria we heard from people were at corners only, or on streets that already have some existing small multifamily buildings, of which there are some examples in the residential area today, or along streets that are served with bus routes. So there's, you know, the possibility of accommodating those new residents through transit, or ones that are adjacent to Richmond 300 nodes. As a group, how do we feel about these criteria? Is it a combination of all these things, or are some of them more important than others? Just wanted to kind of feel out how people reacted to all this. Maybe I'll ask that first before I move on to the next.
That the corners only has any
Yeah,
real bearing on a multifamily building.
Also mentioned just from a legal standpoint, I get a little nervous about tying entitlements to things that are outside of the city's control. GRTC, of course, is an independent agency. They get to pick where their routes are with a little bit of input from the city, but it's not controlling. And so if you're going to create specific streets where you want to identify that it should be available, then you designate those streets with a specific designation, but you don't rely upon GRTC to pick those areas.
Could you just like kind of, yeah, totally valid. Maybe you could like map it to just overlay where the, kind of just do it that way.
We effectively do that with the major streets.
Yeah, we already have that.
So we have back here, this is what we're talking about. properties that front onto these orange streets here within residential.
A lot of those should have buses on them, just eyeballing it, or at least
Yeah.
be within a short walk to one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
and
sure
I
we
guess
could do more
I would
analysis.
challenge or question maybe. I understand where multifamily buildings already exist comes into play, but you know, a lot of, you go back to that map, I think there are plenty of areas where it's certainly appropriate and would help overall in the neighborhood, but there's probably not multifamily buildings already there. So I don't know that having an established multifamily building of any size should be a criteria.
Mhm. Anybody else want to weigh in?
I just want to say I agree with Jennifer about the corner only. I don't see where that's necessary. Like, I think that could be removed from consideration.
What do you mean?
Why would we have to have it, the commercial just on corners only and multifamily, excuse me.
I don't think it's saying it would be
For the residential.
well, it's either on corners and major streets, or just on corners, or just on major streets, or just on whatever else we come up with, right?
Well, it's the sorry, just to clarify, the question here is about major streets. So we're not considering these away from major streets, but it's like, is it on a corner of a major street and another street? Or is it on a major street that already has, you know, a couple of existing buildings like this? Or is it on a major street that's adjacent to a node, et cetera?
And we're just talking about in areas that are currently R1 through R5, right?
More or less. One's within the residential area in Richmond 300, which is mostly R1 through R5.
Also, the clarification I think is really essential is that it's only up to 10 units. So these are really, really small multifamily buildings.
Yeah. But we need to remember what Dave said earlier, that 10 is not necessarily an architecturally like good number for all this, but
Might as well be 9.
12 or 8 or something like that. But yeah.
I mean, Renee, do you want to refresh people's memory with the economic piece of this?
Yeah,
I mean, we ran the model across the entire residential area for all major streets that abut.
Well, specifically for currently areas that are currently zoned R1 and R5 as a kind of representative of. So whenever you see R1 and R5 directly abutting a major street within a residential area, we ran those as sort of two different scenarios. And we also, in addition to, I think Richmond 300 was contemplating small apartment buildings like the ones you see here. So these are taken from an actual one of these major streets within the West End right now. We also ran the scenario of townhouses as an alternative to small apartment buildings, and also stacked townhouses, right? So, and we saw that there was a bit more uptake on the stacked townhouses particularly. So the next question here, and we can go back to the previous one, but would you be equally interested, based on the economic analysis, on seeing townhouses or stacked townhouses allowed in these areas?
I think that, yeah, because we're trying to keep in mind like allowing to happen versus the actually happening. Like all zoning really should do is just be allowing for certain things to happen, and then whether they happen or not, that's for another conversation. This question about townhouses and stacked townhouses, which I guess would be like a 2/2, quote unquote, Stanley Martin type of thing.
That's right.
That sounds more likely to happen within the context of a residential neighborhood. From a financing standpoint, I would guess, if you're trying to get a construction loan to do something and there's no comps for what you're trying to do, and it's hey, I'm on the corner of Richmond and Riker Turnpike and Gladstone, and I want to do a commercial space, I have to be cash only for something like that. So, whereas townhouses, that might be more achievable, and I think that's an interesting question to ask personally.
Yeah, so basically, again, so when we ran the scenario of these three different options, we looked at taking, in this case here, one R1 zoned lot, a huge lot, and doing 10 townhouse units, 20 stacked townhouse units, or basically 30 multifamily units. So it would be three separate, small apartment buildings on that same lot. And this is what it came up with. So obviously, per unit, it's higher on the lower end side. But the one that seemed to kind of fare the most, I think the best was the stacked townhouses.
I think Charlie's right on that one. Certainly the product that we see builders actively looking to deploy in the city, the 2/2 style of product is considerably more prevalent in new builds than a 10 unit or 12 unit multifamily structure. You see multifamily at scale, it's probably north of 100 units per building. It's the larger block, encompassing projects in Scott's Addition. You're not seeing the smaller scale infill multifamily product. That moves us toward, if we want to go to where the market is, the 2/2 unit seems to be the more popular product.
Two over twos.
Anybody
No,
else
so
wanna-
when you think of
go
like
ahead.
a townhome side by side, the 2/2s are like a townhome, first and second floor on the bottom, and then another townhome, second and third floor on the top. So there's
Mhm.
2 units stacked on top of each other, 4 stories.
Thank you for that.
The two different, I mean, they're completely, they're just different things. Like the townhouses are meant to serve a different resident than the multifamily. Like I think that the multifamily is really desirable and a good fit for a lot of people in the city who are looking for housing, who don't want to live in the large Scott's Addition type buildings. The townhouses, which we have a lot of, especially in like, the bottom and Rockets Landing, and those are meant to serve just a different customer. So I think it's, we're here to provide more units. And if we're looking at like what has currently been done, what's traditionally been done, where the market goes, and we're trying to get to a new place. So I think comparing, it is going to be more desirable from people to do the stacked townhouses, but I think we need to keep in mind like what we're here to do, which is to provide more units. So I think I don't think it should just be dictated on where the market goes. I think we should be going off of whatever, what our priorities are, which is coming up with a solution to offer more units. So comparing those two things are just totally different. They're serving different purposes.
I'm really intrigued by this conversation, and you're right, they are totally different. I think that's spot on. But it takes me back to an observation Kevin made earlier, which is why isn't missing middle housing being built in the city? And, we can regulate and say we have a preference toward this kind of product being delivered, but I do think there are probably some economic reasons why it's not feasible, or at least it's not attractive for developers to buy a piece of land, go through the risk and the challenge of developing it for 10 units that have to be managed, because that doesn't provide enough scale to justify the cost that goes into the project. Yet with the 2/2 product, I think we're seeing that there is demand and there's a willingness for the market to provide that product. And so there's a gap between those two things that we probably need to understand, because that's pushing a preference toward one product that we're seeing. And it illustrates that there's a reason why that other product isn't being developed. And so if we say, well, we're going to regulate and authorize this kind of product, but there's a different economic reason why the builders just aren't going to build it, even if it's easy, then we again haven't solved our housing production challenge, our supply challenge.
Piggyback on that, just on a more basic level, a 2/2 requires 4 stories. So a lot of what we've seen is 3 stories. So just from a zoning regulation standpoint, we need to make sure that we would be allowing 4 stories to allow for that product. Because it doesn't, it wouldn't be written that it's a 2/2. It would fall under the use category of the single family or 2 family type. I mean, those types of categories, but you still need to make the box big enough to allow it.
Yeah, for sure.
So what's the difference between the 2/2 and an apartment building if they're both basically the same scale and built to the same quality?
Whether or not it's owner occupied, I mean, condos.
I mean, those are
Yeah.
primarily condominiums, which aren't
Yeah.
treated any differently than a multifamily, but I guess my point was just to make sure that we're allowing 4 stories so that you could have them, because otherwise you can't. Yes. Or otherwise it's a flat over a townhouse, right? So they have those, but that doesn't work everywhere, so.
So Renee, we have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
And I know that there was a number of other questions. I think we could probably spend the last 10 minutes just continuing this conversation, but I want to give the committee, an opportunity for last thoughts and comments. Is there anything else that you could quickly in the next couple of minutes you really want to hit on to close up this discussion?
Yeah, I'm going to skip to the last one briefly and just give you a chance to talk about that. I'll just say one thing here about this. We propose one zone for these areas for discussion, but there also could be more than one. So we could have some areas that are zoned for up to 10 stories we could have some that are zoned for something less. We could have some areas that contemplate townhouses and others that contemplate multifamily. So there's potential for gradation here, and I think we need to think about that a little bit more. Just to skip ahead to the later ones here, I think I'm going to go to the last one here, which is specifically about allowing mixed uses and neighborhood mixed use areas. So this is one I think there was a lot of discussion about before, and so maybe this is a good way to spend the last 10 minutes. We asked specifically before about how you feel about mixed uses within neighborhood mixed use areas. Despite their name, they are mostly residential today. So talking about allowing different types of businesses within those areas, including some of the traditional neighborhoods around the city. We heard a lot of different criteria from people about how those businesses should be limited. Some people felt it should just be allowed across the board. Some people said limited by size, like floor area. Some said only on the ground floor. Some said limited to certain operating hours. Some said only near Richmond 300 nodes, or some said on streets and neighborhoods that already have a tradition of mixed uses where there's already some businesses there. As a group, how do we feel about these kind of criteria? Does anybody want to jump in and say about, is it a combination of these things or some more important than others? How would you regulate these uses within neighborhood mixed use?
My first thought is a combination, but that's a lot.
Renee, I'll let you know, there are some neighborhoods, I'll pick on the fan, that essentially have their own de facto view on what these rules are and where non-residential uses are allowed in the neighborhood. It's going to be really hard to create a one-size-fits-all approach to this that satisfies all of those different stakeholders. This is a tough question.
Yeah.
But that having been said, I think that as we get more and more people moving to the city and we get younger people moving to the city, they're all going to want services that are immediately adjacent to where they live. And everybody deserves to have those. So in order to do that, we've got to find a way to allow all neighborhoods, except maybe 1 or 2 that won't ever get there. All neighborhoods to have that opportunity to have their services in their neighborhood and to not have to be forced into traveling to get something basic or fun.
Agree with David, and I think thinking about like the parking concerns mentioned earlier, that also will help to alleviate some of the parking concerns if folks can just walk and get to necessary services. So, I think we should start from a place of, allowing as much as possible, because that's what's gonna reduce that car dependence that's gonna make folks feel frazzled and stressed out.
There were a lot of comments when I read over the group notes that said they wanted to have uses that serve that neighborhood specifically. And I wanted to know maybe people who said that, what does that mean to you? I'm just trying to think about how we would actually regulate that, or if we could.
Looking at the land use attorneys, I don't think we can.
You
Well,
can really
I'm not-
regulate by use. So you could pick uses that, offices, restaurant, personal service, which is everything. You can pick, but there's only I don't know, I can't even think of a use that you would exclude that would make it feel more serving the neighborhood.
I mean, it could be about size too. We could regulate the size of the use.
Yes,
The point is big,
so if
commercial operations.
like my great sandwich shop wants to go into the ground floor, but I want to have 2,500 square feet and you've got a 2,000 square foot limit, why are you limiting my great sandwich shop, right? Then you got people waiting out on the streets, making noise,
Anybody else want to weigh in?
I was just gonna ask, in light of that, Jennifer, like, is there a way that you can regulate so many types of certain mixed use in a particular area just to diversify it?
No.
Wow.
You also can't say Blanchard's is okay, but Starbucks is not, because Starbucks is a national chain, which may have been a comment that I think all of us received via email from a neighborhood earlier. So to Jennifer's point, you talk about the use, you don't get to pick winners and losers.
But my sandwich shop would be good.
So with the last 5 minutes, is there anything we want to ask Renee or get on the agenda for further discussion next month? I know we talked about how affordable housing is financed, how zoning impacts affordability. We're going to need to continue this conversation because there's some slides we didn't get through on the questions.
I do have one quick comment on, I've talked too much probably on this, but I know that you all took in a bunch of data when you were walking around the various parts of the city. I don't know if you had any data that you put together. I can't remember from any of the other slides on the neighborhoods that had mixed use, not only on corners, but, in a variety of places in the blocks and, views on the vibrancy. Did that impact? I don't know if it goes back to the economic analysis. We hear a lot that's going to decrease the property values around them, which I don't think is accurate in the long run. But if there was any data that would support the benefits of the mixed use within the neighborhoods existing and what those tend to look like and form, I think that would probably be helpful.
Yeah, if you're asking me, I'm not sure that I think maybe Teal was collecting data from the pattern book perspective on uses to identify where there was nonconformities within neighborhoods as part of their analysis.
Right, which is probably all the mixed uses.
Many of the historic areas for sure, yeah, the traditional neighborhoods. So yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, maybe this is a question for Kyle as well here. If you were to allow mixed uses in those areas, I don't think there would be a huge amount of uptake on that necessarily. Kyle, do you think, is that fair to say? I'm not sure.
I think it's fair to say. I think I'd like to, as an economist, I'd like to run the numbers before I make declarative statements.
Yeah. Yes, particularly in sort of, I would guess in sort of like more kind of affluent sort of traditional neighborhoods like the Fan, those residential properties have like enough value by themselves that people are not necessarily being incentivized to turn them into businesses. But yeah, I'm not totally sure. Obviously, there are some businesses that are there.
I think probably like in Churchill, there would be a large connection between like neighborhood mixed use buildings and the increase in property value and development and in certain areas you would see a pretty significant connection between those two.
Yeah, could be. We can sort of explore that some more.
Questions before we, Renee, we have you on the agenda to wrap up and discuss next steps. So are there any other questions for the consulting group before we turn it over to Renee to wrap us up? Or Renee, did you wrap us up?
No, I can say a couple more things just quickly. I know we're kind of at time now, but we're going to share this presentation with everybody. I'm sorry we didn't get through a couple of the questions. I think we covered, the biggest discussion questions on there. But if people want to respond later on by email, you're welcome to share comments with Marianne, and she'll pass them back to us. We'd like to hear any more comments you have, especially if you need some more time to digest it and think about it, or if you have any questions for us or Kyle. Happy to hear any of that. We can circle back to some of this next time as well. I think the next steps for us, we're going to see us presenting a list of draft districts next month in more detail, and also see an initial draft work on the pattern book presented. So that's where we're going to be going next. When we do those draft districts, we'll be getting to the other categories. So we've just been sort of stuck on residential, neighborhood mixed use so far, and we'll get into the other more intensive mixed use areas as well.
It'd be helpful to maybe put agenda of our next meeting, just to, once everyone's had a chance to look at the presentation on their own, and just to kind of ask any additional questions that came up once people have had a chance to kind of digest it all. So Marianne, if we could do that, that'd be great. All right, so we are right at 6 o'clock, perfect timing. We're going to just remind everyone that the next advisory council meeting is November 13th, 4 p.m. here at Plan RVA in the boardroom. And if there's no other comments or questions, we're going to adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.